I have to be honest, this is not the kind of boxing conversation anyone enjoys having, especially when it involves a fighter as iconic as Floyd Mayweather. Because when people talk about Floyd, they usually talk about brilliance. They talk about defense, precision, ring IQ, timing, discipline, and a man who turned boxing into business better than almost anyone the sport has ever seen. But now the conversation has shifted, and not in a good way. Instead of talking about greatness inside the ring, people are talking about money problems, debt lawsuits, asset sales, unpaid obligations, and whether one of the richest fighters in boxing history may have burned through an unbelievable fortune. That is why this story has hit so many fans hard. Floyd Mayweather built his entire image around being untouchable, not just as a boxer, but as a businessman. He sold the world the idea that he had mastered both games. He was a fighter who never lost, and the celebrity who seemed to have cracked the code on wealth. Private jets, exotic cars, giant stacks of cash, designer watches, luxury mansions, and social media posts reminding everybody that his lifestyle was on a level few people could even imagine. For years, that image became part of the brand. Floyd was not just winning fights. He was winning life, or at least that is what it looked like from the outside. Now, however, some of the loudest voices in sports media are questioning whether that image was ever as secure as it appeared. Stephen A. Smith did not hold back when discussing Floyd's financial situation. He made the point that no matter how much money a person earns, reckless spending can swallow all of it if there is no discipline behind the scenes. His message was simple but sharp. It does not matter how gifted you are or how much you made at your peak if you do not protect what you earned. Eventually, the career slows down. The big paydays become less frequent. Age catches up with everyone. And if the money is not there when that happens, the entire picture changes. That warning feels even more serious because it is not coming out of nowhere. Over the years, there have been repeated reports, rumors, and public discussions suggesting that Floyd's spending habits may have gone far beyond even what a massive fortune could comfortably support. People around the sport have pointed to the constant luxury purchases, the obsession with cash, the homes, the fleet of cars, and the need to maintain a larger-than-life image at all times. It is one thing to be rich. It is another thing entirely to feel like you must keep proving it every single day. That is where a lot of people believe Floyd may have crossed from smart branding into dangerous excess. And when you listen to some of the conversations that have surfaced around him, the concern starts to sound more real. The idea being discussed is not simply that Floyd liked expensive things. Everybody knows he liked expensive things. The concern is that the spending may have been so relentless, so constant, and so tied to keeping up the money Mayweather image that even hundreds of millions were not enough to slow the drain. That is the part that shocks people, because most fans still look at Floyd as somebody who made more money than perhaps any boxer ever. To hear people seriously question whether that fortune was mishandled is the kind of thing that completely changes the way his post-retirement life is viewed. Several commentators have framed it the same way. They say the issue is not that Floyd ever lacked earning power. The issue is that his overhead may have become impossible to contain. When your world revolves around mansions, custom jewelry, private travel, luxury shopping, gambling, nightlife, and constant displays of wealth, it becomes very hard to shift into a quieter, more sustainable lifestyle. And for someone like Floyd, whose entire public identity was built on extravagance, stepping away from that image may not have felt like an option. That is why some believe the problem was never how much he made. The problem was how much it cost to keep being Floyd Mayweather every day. That brings us to one of the most uncomfortable parts of this story, which is a suggestion that financial pressure may be pushing him back toward the ring. Over the years, Floyd has always been connected to comeback talk because, frankly, his name still prints money. But when people like 50 Cent publicly suggest that a return is not about passion or legacy, but about needing cash, that hits differently. 50 has openly implied that Floyd's money situation is not what people think it is, and that the need for action, appearances, and events may be tied to financial reality more than competitive desire. With those two, of course, there's always history and tension. So people can debate motive, but when that kind of narrative keeps resurfacing from different directions, fans start paying attention. Another part of the concern comes from reports about tax issues and unpaid obligations. Discussions around large sums allegedly owed to the IRS added fuel to perception that Floyd's financial life may not be nearly as secure as his public image suggested. What made those discussions stand out is that people were not describing some tiny oversight or minor accounting problem. They were talking about massive numbers, the kind of numbers that would make anyone stop and stare. When a man known for flaunting cash is also being discussed in connection with unpaid tax bills and financial disputes, it creates a contrast that is hard to ignore. Then there's the matter of how Floyd handled assets. For years, fans assumed that even if he spent wildly, his investments, real estate, and business structure would protect him. That is how rich people usually stay rich. They make the money work for them. But critics have argued that Floyd did not always move that way. Instead of building an image of steady long-term management, the stories that kept coming out painted a picture of asset leverage, expensive borrowing, property sales, and efforts to keep cash moving through the system. Some reports have even tied private jet borrowing and real estate transactions to a broader effort to manage debt, legal issues, and ongoing obligations. That is where the story becomes less about flashy headlines and more about a pattern. Because a fighter is constantly selling off assets, reducing asking prices on properties, borrowing against what he owns, and taking on more exhibitions and appearances, people are naturally going to ask why. Is it smart financial strategy or is it damage control? That question is hanging over Floyd right now, and it is one of the biggest reasons this topic continues to grow. There is also the issue of business disputes and public claims from people who say they were never fully paid. Logan Paul brought that conversation right back into the spotlight by claiming Floyd still owes him money from their exhibition event. According to Logan, there was a side arrangement involving the sale of rights connected to the fight, and he says he never received the percentage he believes he was owed. He also suggested the company involved later took legal action, which only added more confusion and controversy. Floyd has not publicly addressed those specific claims in a detailed way, but the allegation itself fed the growing narrative that money around Floyd's business dealings has become messy. That was not the only controversy tied to money outside the ring. One of the most heavily criticized chapters in Floyd's post-retirement image involved his association with a cryptocurrency project that was later described by critics as fraudulent. The bigger issue there was not just whether the project failed or whether investors lost interest. It was a larger point about celebrities using their fame to promote things many of them may not fully understand. In Floyd's case, critics argued that his endorsement helped give credibility to something that may not have deserved it, and that once again put his name in a conversation about questionable money moves rather than athletic greatness. The uncomfortable truth is that a lot of these stories have the same theme. They all point back to the idea that Floyd Mayweather, a man who became the face of wealth in boxing, may have spent too much time chasing the appearance of endless money and not enough time protecting the fortune he actually built. That is a brutal thing to say about someone of his stature, but it is exactly why the conversation has become so intense. Nobody expects a fighter like Floyd to be struggling in any financial sense. That image simply does not match the version of him people have been sold for years. At the same time, none of this erases what Floyd accomplished in boxing. That is important to remember. He is still one of the most gifted fighters the sport has ever seen. His defensive mastery, control of distance, patience, and ability to make elite opponents look ordinary were extraordinary. He knew how to win, and he knew how to maximize his value in an era where fighters became more conscious of the business side than ever before. You can criticize the spending, the decisions, the financial management, and the controversies without pretending he was not brilliant in the ring. He absolutely was. But that is also part of the tragedy here. A fighter with that kind of ability should have had an almost untouchable landing after retirement. Instead, the headlines keep circling back to whether the money was handled properly, whether debts piled up, whether taxes were neglected, whether promotions were questionable, and whether more fights are being lined up because they are needed, not wanted. For a man who once made invincibility look effortless, that kind of public perception is damaging. And now Floyd is stepping back into an active year of events, with multiple high-profile fights and exhibitions reportedly on the table. That has only increased speculation that this comeback is about more than staying visible. On paper, it is a smart strategy. Big names, global streaming, huge audiences, international venues, sponsorship money, and event-driven revenue all create a chance to generate serious cash without relying only on old-school pay-per-view formulas. In today's combat sports world, celebrity exhibitions, streaming partnerships, and international boxing events can still bring in massive money if marketed the right way. Floyd understands that better than almost anyone. So from a business standpoint, you can see the logic. If the name still sells, why not use it? If major platforms and promoters are willing to put money behind the events, why not collect? If global audiences will still tune in just to see Floyd Mayweather under the lights, why not turn that into another revenue stream? That is the argument from one side. The other side is much harsher. It says this is not some clever extension of a legendary brand. It says this is a veteran fighter being forced to keep cashing checks because his financial foundation is not what it should have been. That is exactly where Stephen A. Smith's criticism becomes bigger than Floyd alone. Smith has argued for years that Floyd's influence on younger athletes is complicated. He believes many athletes admire the wealth, the freedom, the self-promotion, and the control Floyd built around his name. But he also thinks too many of them focus on the money image instead of the discipline and mastery that made Floyd who he was in the first place. In that view, the flashy side of Mayweather has become more influential than the technical genius, and that sends a dangerous message to the next generation. That criticism lands because it forces people to ask what Floyd's real legacy is. Is it the undefeated record, the elite boxing skills, the business success, the spectacle, the money, the lifestyle, or is it all of it mixed together in a way that is impossible to separate? Because when athletes look at Floyd, many of them do not just see a fighter. They see a blueprint for control, independence, brand power, and wealth. They see a man who answered to almost nobody and turned himself into a global business. That part of the legacy is real. But the financial rumors, lawsuits, debts, and asset sales are as serious as people claim. Then the blueprint may not be nearly as solid as it looked. And that is why this whole situation feels so disappointing to so many boxing fans. It is not because Floyd made money. It is not because he enjoyed luxury. It is not even because he always leaned into the money persona. It is because people expected that someone so obsessed with financial success would be the last person facing public questions about whether the fortune held up. They expected the image and the reality to match. Right now, many are not so sure. The saddest part may be that Floyd does not need anyone to remind people his greatness in the ring. That part of his legacy is secure. But what is happening now risks shifting the focus away from the genius and toward the chaos, away from the master boxer and toward the businessman under scrutiny, away from the unbeaten champion and toward the celebrity trying to keep the machine alive. So the big question now is whether this comeback year actually changes anything. Can these events bring in enough money to stabilize whatever financial issues are hanging over him? Can Floyd turn his name into another wave of major earnings and quiet the speculation? Or are these fights simply buying time while deeper problems remain unresolved? That is a question fans are asking. And until there are clearer answers, the doubt is not going anywhere. At the end of the day, Floyd Mayweather is still one of the most important figures boxing has produced in the modern era. That will not change. But this chapter of his career is no longer just about fame, fortune, or even legacy. It is about whether one of the richest stars the sport has ever seen actually protected what he built, or whether the image of unlimited money hit a much more fragile reality. And for fans who admired him at his peak,